Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Science Guide. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe the day has been long, full of noise and movement, and the small, relentless demands that modern life makes of you. Maybe you're exactly the kind of person who finds it easier to settle into sleep while thinking about something vast and ancient, about cities that no longer exist, about streets that only the wind walks now, about civilizations that rose and shone and slowly, quietly became something else. Either way, tonight's journey was made for you. You don't need to do anything right now except settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath find its own natural pace, slow and unhurried, like water moving through deep stone. Let the weight of the day press down into the surface beneath you until you feel held, completely supported, with nothing left to carry. Before we begin, if these slow journeys into the world's quiet places help you unwind or give you a peaceful way to close your eyes at the end of the day, I would love it if you left a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps other people who need this find their way here. And I have a small question for you tonight. Drop a comment and let me know which country you're listening from. I always love to see where in the world this reaches, one sleepy corner at a time. Now, let's go somewhere very old. Picture a desert at night, not a dramatic one, not the kind from films with perfectly lit orange dunes and a dramatic sky. Just a real one, flat, wide, gray-brown under the stars, extending in every direction until it curves away from sight. The sky above it is enormous. In this kind of place, far from any city, far from any electric light, the stars are not merely pretty, they are a presence. They are so dense and so bright that the darkness between them seems to hum with whatever it is that makes darkness feel inhabited. The air is cold now. Whatever heat the day pressed into the ground has already been given back to the sky, and the surface is cooling quickly towards something approaching silence. A wind moves across the desert floor, not strongly, barely a breath, just enough to lift the finest grains of sand from their places and carry them a few centimeters before setting them down again. This wind has been doing this every night for thousands of years. Patient and indifferent, it rearranges the surface by fractions, year by year, covering what is low and exposing what resists. It does not hurry, it has no intention. It simply moves, and in moving, changes everything, slowly. Somewhere under your imagined feet, if you were standing in the right stretch of desert, in the Sahara perhaps, or in the vast dry plains of Pakistan, or in the red plateaus of Peru, there are walls, stone walls, built by human hands that have been gone for 1,000 years or more. Some of them are still standing, holding their shape in the dark beneath the sand, keeping the geometry of rooms where people once argued and cooked and held their children and watched the same stars that hang above you now. The sand came for these walls so slowly, so gently, so completely, that from above there is no sign they were ever there. But they are there. They have not moved. They are simply waiting, the way things wait when time no longer applies to them. This is where we are going tonight, not to ruins in the dramatic sense, not to the shattered columns and tourist photographs of famous ancient sites. We are going to something quieter and stranger. We are going to the places that became invisible, to the cities that became sand and water and forest and story, to the civilizations that did not so much fall as they dissolved slowly into the landscape that had always surrounded them. What is a civilization, really? We say the word so often that it loses its weight. We say ancient civilization the way we say old building, as a shorthand for something that was once important and is now mostly interesting. But a civilization is not a building. It is not even a collection of buildings. It is something more intimate than that and more fragile. A civilization is a shared agreement among people about what matters. It is the accumulated meaning of thousands of ordinary days, of people waking up under the same kind of morning, going to sleep under the same kind of sky, trusting that the world as they understand it will still be recognizable tomorrow. A civilization is what happens when enough people in enough proximity decide together that certain things are worth doing, that the river should be named, that the dead should be honored in a particular way, that the movements of stars carry meaning, that stories should be passed to children in a specific order and with specific words. This is what makes a civilization fragile in a way that stone is not. Stone can withstand centuries. A shared agreement cannot survive without the people who hold it. And people, in the end, always move on. They migrate, they die. They adapt to conditions that no longer require the old agreements. And the civilization, not the buildings, not the roads, but the living agreement between minds, fades first, before any wall crumbles. There is a difference between a civilization that is lost and a civilization that is gone. A city is not lost when sand covers its walls. It is lost when the last person who remembered what those walls meant stops speaking. When the name that once meant home to 10,000 people is no longer pronounced by any living mouth. When the story that gave a place its weight is no longer held inside a living mind. That is the true vanishing, not the burial under sand or water or forest. The earth handles that with a kind of careful patience, but the silence of meaning, the moment when a place becomes merely stone, merely geography, merely matter arranged in a shape that once had someone to call it what it was. Can a civilization truly disappear? Or does it scatter the way seeds scatter in the wind, finding new soil in different places, growing in forms no longer recognizable as the original, but still carrying something of its essential nature forward? That question is worth holding tonight, not answering, just holding, lightly, the way you hold a smooth stone in a dark room, feeling its weight without needing to explain it. Now let us go into the sand. In the region of southwestern Libya, known as the Fezzan, one of the most remote and punishing stretches of the Sahara Desert anywhere on Earth, there lived a civilization that the Romans called the Garamantes. The Romans, who liked to think of themselves as the measure of all civilized things, described the Garamantes with the particular condescension that empires reserve for people they cannot quite conquer. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, mentioned them as a people who chased cave dwellers across the desert in 4-horse chariots. Colorful, strange, peripheral. Desert people, not worth serious attention. The Romans were wrong. What satellite archaeology and careful modern excavation have revealed over the past several decades is something that reframes the entire picture. More than 100 fortified settlements spread across the desert region, walled cities, not temporary encampments, not scattered villages, but planned, permanent, stone-built cities with multiple stories and organized streets. Agricultural fields that once produced grain, grapes, olives, and dates in quantities sufficient to feed populations in the tens of thousands. Long-distance trade routes connecting the Mediterranean coast to sub-Saharan Africa. Ivory and gold and enslaved people moving north. Salt and manufactured goods, and the knowledge of new technologies moving south. with the Garamantes at the hinge point, the invisible pivot on which an entire continental economy turned. A written language, pyramid tombs, an army capable of fighting the Roman legions across 2 centuries without being subdued. And beneath it all, the thing that made everything else possible, an engineering achievement so extraordinary that modern researchers still pause when they describe it. They are called phagoras, underground tunnels, narrow enough that a grown adult would have to stoop and turn sideways to move through them, cut through sand and gravel and clay, and sometimes through solid sandstone, by human hands working in darkness, in suffocating heat, deep below the Saharan surface. Modern archaeologists have identified more than 550 of these tunnels in the Wadi al-Ajal region alone. Together they extend for more than 750 kilometers beneath the desert, more than 750 kilometers of hand-cut tunnel in the dark, in the deep earth, in a desert where the surface temperature can reach 55 degrees Celsius in summer and where it sometimes does not rain for years at a stretch. Each tunnel was built at a precisely calculated downward angle, shallow enough to be dug by hand tools, steep enough to make water flow by gravity alone. Without any pump or mechanism, the water, once reached, would travel through the dark toward the surface entirely on its own, guided only by the mathematics of slope, carrying itself through the stone and clay toward the fields and cities waiting above. The water they were reaching was not ordinary groundwater. It was something older. It was fossil water, rain that had fallen on the Sahara between 11,000 and 5,000 years before, during a period when the Great Desert was green. There were lakes then, reflecting the sky in places that are now pure sand. Rivers ran to the sea through valleys whose ghost shapes are barely visible from the air. That world ended long before the Garamantes arrived. The rains had stopped, the surface had dried, the lakes had retreated into memory. But underground, sealed in an enormous sandstone aquifer, far beneath the desert floor, the water of that green world was still there, still liquid, still held by the rock. The Garamantes somehow knew where to find it. At its height, the Garamantian capital of Garama, present-day Jarma, held perhaps 4,000 people within its walls, with another 6,000 in the surrounding satellite villages. The kingdom as a whole covered roughly 70,000 square miles of the central Sahara, and it is estimated that the construction of the Fagara system required at least 72,000 man-years of accumulated labor, the equivalent of 7,000 workers, working for a decade exclusively on the tunnels just to build them before any maintenance began. This was not a peripheral struggling culture. This was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in ancient human history, executed in the most hostile environment on Earth by people the Romans considered barbarians. What ended them was not invasion. It was not plague. It was the patient mathematics of an aquifer being drawn down faster than it could be replenished. The Sahara, in its modern state, receives almost no rainfall, nothing that could recharge a deep fossil water reserve. 6 centuries of extraction drew the water table down, slowly and irreversibly, millimeter by millimeter, year by year, until it fell below the level of the lowest tunnels. The water did not vanish suddenly. It retreated gradually below the reach of human hands, and the cities that had been made possible by that water contracted, generation by generation, until they were no longer recognizable as themselves. By the time Islamic forces arrived in the region in the 7th century of the Common Era, there was still a king at Garama, but the Phagoras had mostly gone dry. The population had shrunk to whatever smaller number the remaining wells could support. The Great Desert Kingdom had not fallen in any dramatic sense. It had simply become insufficient, too reduced, too quiet, too dependent on a resource that was no longer there. The mud brick walls of its cities softened over centuries in the occasional rain and the endless wind, settling into the landscape with a kind of grace, becoming part of the desert they had spent 1,000 years defying. Some of those walls are still there today, still holding the shapes of rooms. The sand moves around them and sometimes over them. The wind continues, as it always has, farther east, in the vast arid stretches of what are now Pakistan and northwestern India. Another civilization had negotiated with water and drought on a different timeline. The Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes called the Harappan Civilization, flourished between roughly 3,300 and 1,300 before the Common Era. At its height, it stretched across a territory larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its cities, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, were planned with a precision that still catches the breath. Standardized brick sizes, consistent across cities hundreds of kilometers apart, as if some central authority had decided once and for all what a brick should measure. And all the cities had agreed. Multi-story buildings of fired brick, not mud brick, indicating a level of production capacity that required enormous coordination. Covered drainage systems running beneath the streets, among the most sophisticated urban sanitation systems anywhere in the ancient world. Public baths with floors sealed with natural bitumen to prevent leakage, where thousands of people could have bathed. Wide, straight streets on an organized grid. Granaries large enough to feed populations in the tens of thousands. And yet their writing system, thousands of inscriptions, pressed into clay seals, carved into stone, distributed across the entire civilization, has never been deciphered. Every inscription is there, perfectly visible, perfectly preserved in many cases. Scholars have studied them for a century. They have identified recurring symbols and structural patterns, but the sounds and meanings behind those symbols remain sealed inside them. Whatever language these cities spoke, whatever it sounded like on an ordinary afternoon in a market in Mohenjo-daro, whatever the children learned to say first, has not come back. The chain broke, and there is no way back across a break that long. What happened to these cities follows the same quiet pattern as the Garamantian story. The great river systems that sustained them began to change. The Gagar-Hakra River, which some researchers identify with the Sarasvati of ancient texts, shifted course or substantially diminished due to tectonic movement and long-term changes in monsoon patterns. Changes that unfolded not over years, but over centuries. Imperceptible to any individual generation, agriculture faltered as the hydrology shifted. The cities did not burn. They emptied gradually, generation by generation. As people moved southward and eastward following water and better conditions, carrying what they could carry, leaving behind the things too heavy or too fixed to move, the drainage channels of Mohenjo-daro continued to run their courses from buildings that no longer held anyone, towards streets that no longer carried footsteps. 4,000 years later, archaeologists found those channels intact, still shaped for the function they had been designed to serve, in a world where that function had long since disappeared. Sand and time, human effort, and the slow weight of centuries. They give themselves to each other gradually. One does not have to consume the other. One simply has more patience than the other. Now let us leave the sand and go somewhere else entirely. Let us go to the water, the sea level we experience today. The coastlines we know, the beaches we walk in summer, is not the sea level of 10,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years before the present, So much of the Earth's water was locked inside continental ice sheets that the global sea level was approximately 120 meters lower than it is right now. The continental shelves, the shallower parts of the ocean floor that surround the continents, were dry land. The coastlines of the ancient world extended far beyond where they are today. Entire landscapes, with their own hills and valleys and river deltas and estuaries, lay exposed and habitable for thousands of years. This matters enormously when we think about where human beings lived. People always settle near water. Rivers and coastlines and estuaries are where fish are caught, where trade can flow, where fresh water meets the sea and creates the most productive ecosystems. The great prehistoric settlements, the communities that preceded our recorded history by thousands of years, would have clustered along coastlines and rivers. And as the ice melted, slowly, over centuries and millennia, those coastlines moved inland. Whatever communities had been built on those shores went under the water. Whatever they built, whatever they named, whatever stories they told about the particular arrangement of land and sea that they called home, it went under with them, mostly without a trace. Off the coast of southern Greece, in a sheltered bay near the Peloponnese, there is a place called Pavlopetri. The name itself is ordinary. It translates simply as Paul's Stone, a later Christian naming that has nothing to do with whoever originally lived there. But in 2 to 4 meters of clear, shallow Mediterranean water, in conditions calm enough to snorkel on any ordinary afternoon, the oldest known submerged city in the world is lying on the seafloor. Pavlopetri is more than 5,000 years old. Its streets are still there. The outlines of its buildings, still rectangular, still organized into the recognizable geometry of a planned settlement, are still visible on the seafloor. Courtyards, a central plaza roughly 40 meters long and 20 meters wide, at least 15 separate buildings identified, some with up to 12 rooms. A water management system of channels and gutters still running beneath what was once a main square. A cemetery located just outside the main settlement with stone-lined graves intact. And everywhere, pottery, the kind of pottery that ancient craftspeople made by imitating the fashionable styles arriving from Minoan Crete to the south. Local artisans keeping their community on the cutting edge of Mediterranean taste. This is not a scattered field of broken fragments. This is a complete, largely preserved, 5,000-year-old town plan, lying in water clear enough to swim through. The city was originally built around 3,500 before the Common Era, when the land it stood on was slightly above sea level. Its people traded with the Minoans, managed a working harbor, arranged their houses along streets, and buried their dead in graves they marked with care. It was a functioning community, as ordinary and as extraordinary as any community that has ever existed. Around 1000 before the Common Era, after a series of earthquakes subsided, the land and the sea moved in, the people left, the city became the seafloor. The streets stayed where they were, the walls of the buildings stayed where they were, the graves stayed where they were, and the Mediterranean settled over everything, and the fish moved in through the open doorways, and the world above continued as if the city had never been. We do not know what the people who lived there called their city. We do not know what language they spoke in its markets, what songs were sung in its houses at night, what names they gave their children, what they called the harbor, what they believed happened after death. The shape of the city is there. Its voice is gone. In the waters of Egypt's Abu Qir Bay, 12 meters below the surface, the city of Thonis Herakleion waited for more than 1,200 years before being found. To the ancient Egyptians, it was Thonis. To the Greek traders who passed through its harbor on the way to Egypt's interior, it was Herakleion. It was one of the most important port cities of the ancient Mediterranean, the primary entry point for goods arriving from the Greek-speaking world, a place where cultures mixed continuously and wealth moved in every direction. The historian Herodotus mentioned it. Other ancient writers described its temples and its wealth. And then, gradually, the references stopped, and the city itself could not be located, and scholars began debating whether it had ever existed as described, or whether it was partly legend, partly literary exaggeration. For more than 1,000 years it was lost, not merely forgotten, but actively missing, searched for and not found. In the year 2000, the French archaeologist Frank Gaudio found it, 7 kilometers from the modern Egyptian shore, under the accumulated sediment of many centuries. The city was there. It had been there all along. Colossal statues of pharaohs, some weighing several tons, still largely intact after more than 12 centuries on the seafloor. Gold jewelry, bronze ritual objects, coins spanning more than 1,000 years of occupation. Approximately 70 ancient ships resting near the city's ruins, the largest collection of ancient vessels ever found in a single location, anywhere on Earth. A stone inscription carved by royal decree that confirmed once and for all that Daunis and Herakleion were 2 different names for the same city, each used by a different culture passing through it. Only 5% of the site has been excavated. 95% remains in the sediment, holding whatever it holds, undisturbed in the quiet dark of 12 meters depth. The city fell not to invaders, but to the earth itself, a process called liquefaction, where ground that appears solid loses its integrity under repeated seismic stress and behaves briefly like a liquid, caused the land beneath the city to give way. Buildings that had stood for centuries sank into the earth over a period of hours or days. The sea moved over them, and the city became the seafloor, as Pavlopetri had become the seafloor, as so many other places had become the seafloor, quietly, without drama, in the way that many endings actually happen. There is something in the image of a sunken city that resonates with the feeling of falling asleep. The way the ordinary world of streets and daylight is replaced by something deeper and quieter. The way the surface recedes and the pressure of depth takes over, holding everything still. The streets of Pavlopetri are not gone. They are simply held in a different way now, held by water instead of by the feet of the people who once walked them. The fish that move through the doorways of those 5,000-year-old buildings are not intruders. They are the current occupants. Let your breathing slow. Let yourself be a little heavier than you were a moment ago. Let the surface recede. Now let us go somewhere warmer. Into the forest. In the lowland rainforest of what is now Cambodia, at its height in the 12th century of the Common Era, the Khmer Empire built the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. The city of Angkor and its surroundings held somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. More than medieval London, more than Paris at the same period, more than any urban settlement existing anywhere in the world at that time. Its engineers constructed a hydraulic system of extraordinary complexity. Reservoirs, canals, irrigation channels, moats and overflow systems stretching across more than 1,000 square kilometers, designed to capture the monsoon rains and release them slowly, steadily through the dry months to sustain rice cultivation across the entire region. The temples they built, above all Angkor Wat, which remains the largest religious monument ever constructed by human hands, were not merely places of worship. They were cosmological maps built at the scale of the landscape. The proportions of the temple complex encoded the measurements of Hindu sacred geometry. The distances between major structures reflected astronomical relationships. The entire city was a piece of sacred intention, made physical at a scale that required the coordinated labor of entire generations of the population. Water was the engine of everything. The hydraulic system was the reason the city existed at all, and the reason it could sustain its size, control the water, sustain the agriculture, sustain the population, sustain the complexity. But this system had been calibrated for a specific hydrological reality, for the regular, predictable rhythms of monsoon and dry season that had prevailed for centuries, and that the engineers had designed around. Tree ring data recovered from ancient trees in neighboring Vietnam tells us what eventually happened. A prolonged drought struck the region in the 1330s and lasted for roughly 3 decades. Then came years of unusually intense monsoon rains, pouring more water through the canal systems than the infrastructure, weakened by years of reduced maintenance during the drought, could safely handle. Canals that had functioned for centuries were choked with sediment carried in by the floods. Some were eroded 8 meters below the surrounding landscape. A canal connecting the capital to a major lake was apparently filled with coarse sand and gravel in a single catastrophic flood event, suddenly severing the city from one of its most important water sources. The common story says Angkor fell in 1431 when forces from a neighboring kingdom sacked the capital. But the archaeological evidence from drill cores taken beneath the city's temple moats tells a slower story. There is no sudden layer of destruction in the sediment, no sharp boundary between occupation and abandonment. Instead, there is a long, gradual dimming, pollen records showing the forest slowly recovering as farming retreated, charcoal levels declining as fires were lit less often, the signatures of a dense population quietly thinning over generations. The city was not destroyed. It was departed from, gradually, by people making individual decisions to go elsewhere, to the coast, to the trading cities of the Mekong Delta, to a different kind of life, in a different kind of place. And the forest moved in. The forest never hurries. This is the thing that strikes anyone who spends time at the ruins of Angkor, particularly at the Temple of Ta Prohm, which was deliberately left in its partially reclaimed state when conservation began. The roots of the strangler fig trees are enormous, as thick as a person's torso, some of them flowing down the sides of stone walls like frozen rivers, gray and cool in the perpetual shade of the canopy above. These roots have found every joint and crack in the ancient masonry and widened each one by fractions of a millimeter, year by year, for 5 or 6 centuries. Some roots have lifted carved stone lintels that have been in place for 700 years. Others have fused so completely with the stone faces and lotus motifs carved into the walls that removing them now would cause the structures beneath to collapse. The temple and the trees have become a single thing. Each is holding the other up. This is not erasure. It is something more ambiguous. The forest is not destroying the temple. It is incorporating it, making it part of something larger and older and slower than any human plan. The roots do not know they are growing through a sacred building. They are simply doing what roots do, finding water and stability and light, indifferent to the meaning that human beings pressed into the stone they are slowly embracing. Thousands of kilometers away, in the lowland jungles of Central America, the cities of the classic Maya period waited inside the forest. Aerial surveys using LiDAR technology, laser systems that can penetrate the rainforest canopy and map the topography of what lies beneath, have transformed our understanding of how densely the Maya lowlands were once settled. Beneath the green ceiling of the canopy, there are roads connecting cities across distances of many kilometers. Agricultural terraces cut into hillsides with extraordinary precision, extending over entire landscapes. Canal systems, pyramids, suburban settlements stretching far beyond the ceremonial centers that archaeologists had spent a century excavating. A civilization of a scale and density that the jungle had concealed so thoroughly that it could only be revealed by lasers flying overhead in the 21st century. And the Maya astronomers who built those cities tracked the movements of Venus with a precision that rivals modern calculation, knowing the pattern of its appearances and disappearances in the sky to within a fraction of a day. Their mathematicians developed the concept of zero independently. Their architects built the Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza so precisely that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the angle of the afternoon sun creates a shadow along the northern staircase that moves like a feathered serpent descending toward the earth. A shadow that moves exactly as intended every equinox, because the calculation built into the pyramid's angles more than 1,000 years ago is still mathematically correct. They built for time. They built for people they would never meet. Between roughly 800 and 900 of the Common Era, something happened across the southern Maya lowlands. City after city went quiet. Construction stopped. Populations that had numbered in the tens of thousands disappeared from the archaeological record. The great stone centers fell silent. And the forest came back. Cave stalagmites record the chemistry of rainfall year by year, layer by layer, in their mineral deposits. They show that the period was punctuated by severe, prolonged droughts. A civilization dependent on rain-fed agriculture in a region with no permanent rivers could not easily survive 10 or 20 consecutive years of failed rains. But the Maya did not disappear. Their descendants are present today, approximately 7 million people, speaking dozens of distinct Maya languages, living in communities whose cultures descend directly from the classic period. The collapse was the collapse of a particular political and architectural tradition in a particular region during a particular century. Not a people, not a culture, not a language. The people continued. The people continue still. Now, something quieter, something that asks us to think carefully about what knowledge is and where it lives. There have always been civilizations that did not develop writing. This is sometimes taken as evidence of limited sophistication, but this says more about the assumptions of the people making the judgment than it does about the civilizations being judged. Oral traditions are not the absence of writing. They are a different and equally sophisticated technology for storing and transmitting complex information across generations. The Vedas of ancient India were transmitted orally for thousands of years before anyone wrote them down. Practitioners believed oral transmission could actually be more reliable than written copies, because a scribe could make an error that would propagate, while the rhythms and structures of oral recitation made errors detectable and correctable through the community of practitioners. But oral traditions require living people, and there is a particular silence that comes from a chain of transmission being broken. Not the silence of a library burning, not the dramatic silence of destruction, but the quiet, unmarked silence of the second-to-last speaker. Because a language needs at least 2 people to exist as a living thing. When only one person remains who knows a language, who thinks in its particular rhythms, who dreams in its sounds, that language is already ending, even though the last speaker is still there, still alive, still carrying the world that the language makes possible. And when that person is gone, the world goes with them. the people of the Indus Valley pressed their symbols into clay seals. They arranged them with the evident care of people who believed they were saying something important. Thousands of those seals survive, perfectly visible, perfectly clear as physical objects. We can see every mark. We cannot hear any word. The sounds behind those symbols are gone, not destroyed, but no longer carried. The difference is important. Destruction implies violence. This is something else. This is simply absence, the quiet of a voice that stopped. There are languages on Earth right now, dozens of them being spoken by a single living person. Everything those languages contain, the particular categories they made from experience, the distinctions they drew that other languages do not draw, the way they organize the relationship between a person and a landscape and a sky, exists in one mind. And when that mind is done, it will not exist anywhere, not destroyed, just no longer held. There are places in the archaeological record where the evidence suggests that people were simply there and then were not destroyed, not gradually depleted, just gone within what the archaeology suggests was a relatively short span of time, leaving behind everything they could not carry. The cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloan people, tucked into the faces of canyon walls in what is now Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, are among the most evocative of these sudden-seeming absences. Multi-story buildings fitted precisely into the natural rock overhangs of the canyon walls, oriented for solar warmth in winter and natural shade in summer, connected by hand-cut steps to the canyon floors hundreds of feet below. The rooms were small and neat, built with careful stonework. The views from the doorways were extraordinary. Wide canyon distances, morning light arriving at particular angles that would have been as familiar to the inhabitants as the view from your own window is to you right now. They had been occupied for generations, and then, in the last decades of the 13th century, over what appears to have been a relatively short span of time, they were empty, not burned, not destroyed, just empty. Pottery on shelves, tools in their places, kiva ceremonial chambers with painted walls intact, fire pits still holding the memory of the last fire, storage rooms with the remains of food. Destruction implies violence. This is something else. This is simply absence. The quiet of a voice that stopped. The everyday objects of lives that were interrupted and not resumed, or rather, continued elsewhere, in new places, under new arrangements. Tree ring data from ancient trees across the American Southwest is unambiguous. A prolonged, severe drought struck the Four Corners region in the 1270s and 1280s and lasted for more than 2 decades. The people moved, not chaotically, not in panic, but methodically, carrying what mattered, leaving what did not. They traveled southward and eastward toward the Rio Grande, toward more reliable water. Their descendants, the contemporary Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, are still there today, still practicing traditions that carry forward everything brought south from those canyon walls 8 centuries ago. The buildings remained, and in the rooms that had once held ordinary lives, the arguments and the laughter, and the particular quiet of a settlement at midnight, the silence settled slowly, like dust. Not the silence of catastrophe, the silence of a family that has moved on, leaving the old house standing. Çatalhöyük, in what is now central Turkey, was occupied for more than 1,000 years, beginning around 7,500 before the Common Era, making it among the oldest known urban settlements on Earth. Its inhabitants lived in a density almost impossible to imagine. Houses were built directly against each other, with no streets or alleys between them. The entire settlement was a continuous block of rooms, accessible only from above. Entry and exit through holes cut in the flat rooftops. Movement through the town meant walking across its rooftops and descending through its ceilings. The inhabitants painted their walls with elaborate murals. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes, sleeping above their ancestors in the most literal sense imaginable. They stored grain in sealed bins and left clay figurines in their rooms, some depicting figures that may have had ritual meaning, others that look simply like the small objects people have always made for reasons we may never fully recover. Around 6000 before the Common Era, the settlement was abandoned, left to the centuries. The mud bricks softened, the painted murals faded into the walls, the bones beneath the floors remained where they had been placed, and in the long silence that followed, the settlement became a mound, a tell in the archaeological terminology, rising gently above the surrounding plain, its height the accumulated debris of 1,000 years of human habitation, pressing down into the earth. Now let us turn our eyes upward, away from the sand and the water and the forest. Every culture that achieved enough stability to observe the sky carefully over long periods eventually noticed the same fundamental thing. The heavens move, but they move in patterns. The sun rises and sets. The moon swells and diminishes. The stars rotate overhead through the night, but they rotate predictably. The same stars, always in the same relative positions. The same patterns returning season after season with a reliability that nothing in human life can match. In a world without any other way to measure time across longer periods, the ability to read those patterns was among the most practically valuable knowledge a civilization could possess. Stonehenge stands on the Salisbury Plain of southern England. It was not built all at once. It evolved through multiple phases of construction across more than 2,000 years, beginning around 3,000 before the Common Era. The people who built it left no written records. We do not know what they called themselves, what language they spoke, what stories they told about the stones. What we know is this: on the morning of the summer solstice, the rising sun aligns precisely through the monument with the heel stone, casting light toward the center. On the evening of the winter solstice, the setting sun aligns from the opposite direction. The great sarsen stones weigh up to 25 tons each, and they came from a source roughly 30 kilometers away. The smaller blue stones came from the Preseli Hills in Wales, approximately 250 kilometers distant. The effort required to move those stones and place them in their precise positions is difficult to calculate, but it was immense. And it was not done once. It was done repeatedly, across more than 1,000 years, by many generations who inherited the project and continued it. This is the behavior of people who considered something worth maintaining across time. We do not know what, but we can feel the commitment in the stones themselves, in the fact that they are still standing, still aligned, still catching the solstice light in exactly the way they were intended to catch it 5,000 years ago. In the southern Egyptian desert, at a site called Nabta Playa, there is a stone circle that is at least 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. Its stones appear to align with the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, at the time when that rising would have announced the beginning of monsoon rains in the Saharan region of that era. The people who built Nabta Playa lived in a Sahara that was still receiving seasonal rainfall. They were watching for signs, and what they saw, they remembered in stone. The Maya encoded their astronomical knowledge at a scale that is difficult to fully absorb. The Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza is built for a shadow that descends its northern staircase correctly, not just for one generation, willing to stand at the right place at the right. Time, they were not calculating for themselves alone. They were calculating for people they would never know, in a future they could not see. They built for time because they understood time in a way that included but extended far beyond their own lifetimes. And when the classic Maya cities fell silent and the forest moved back, some of that astronomical knowledge scattered into the world. Some survived in the few books that escaped the colonial era destruction. Some survived in oral traditions within communities that endured through every upheaval. The knowledge did not simply vanish. It went underground, the way water goes underground, still moving, harder to see, waiting for conditions that would allow it to surface again. Some of the most persistent questions about lost civilizations live in the space between what can be verified and what can only be imagined, between the historical and the mythological, between what happened and what the story says happened. Troy is the most famous example. For centuries, the city of Troy existed primarily as literature. The great poems attributed to Homer, the 10-year war on the coast of Anatolia, the wooden horse, and the burning towers. Most educated people in the 19th century treated it as magnificent fiction. Then Heinrich Schliemann dug at a mound called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, and beneath it he found not one Troy, but 9. Cities built on top of cities across more than 3,000 years of continuous habitation. The city that corresponds in time to the Trojan War story shows evidence of violent destruction, burned buildings, human remains, arrowheads embedded in the ruins. A city that ended abruptly, in the way that cities end when force arrives from outside. Whether the war unfolded as Homer describes, with the particular heroes and gods and the wooden horse, cannot be known from the archaeological evidence alone. What we know is that a real city existed in exactly that location, that it was important enough to fight over, and that it was destroyed. The poem accumulated across many centuries of oral transmission before being written down, each generation adding its own elaborations. But at its core, something real happened. The story is not pure invention. It is the memory of something real, filtered through the long alchemy of telling and retelling until only the essential shape remains. Plato's account of Atlantis, written around 360 before the Common Era, describes a great island civilization destroyed by the gods in a single day and night, swallowed by the sea. Scholars have debated for more than 2,000 years whether this was intended as literal history, as philosophical allegory, or as something in between. What is interesting, from where we now stand, is how many cities genuinely were swallowed by the sea. Thonis Heracleion, Pavlopetri, dozens of other coastal settlements across the Mediterranean and beyond, submerged as ice melted and sea levels rose across thousands of years. Whatever communities existed on those coastlines went under without leaving any record above the waves. If stories about those submersions accumulated across centuries of oral tradition and eventually reached Plato, he may have been writing something mythologically true, even if not historically literal. The name may be invented, the pattern, the city, the sea, the loss is not. And this is what the oldest layer of human storytelling often does. It keeps the shape of what happened long after the specific details have blurred. The story is a different kind of container than writing, more flexible, more vulnerable to distortion, but also capable of carrying a kind of essential truth, the truth of pattern, of what it feels like to lose something that was once the whole world. Now something even slower. The slow collapses, the ones that no one notices while they are happening. The Western Roman Empire did not fall on a single day. It fell across centuries. The great historian Edward Gibbon spent his life writing about this process, and his account runs to many volumes because the process itself ran to many generations. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, more than 50 different men had claimed the imperial throne, most of them dying violently within a few years of rising. The military campaigns required to maintain a frontier stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia consumed resources at a rate that increasingly exceeded what the empire could generate. A plague swept through populations connected by the same roads and trade networks that had been Rome's greatest strength. The climate shifted. The warm, wet conditions that had supported agricultural expansion across centuries gave way to cooler, drier patterns across large parts of the western provinces. Each stress, in isolation, was survivable. The empire had survived plagues before and recovered. It had survived military crises and political instability. It had experienced drought and bounced back, but together, across generations, compounding, each stress making the system slightly less capable of absorbing the next, they were not survivable. Each simplification of the system made further simplification more likely. The feedback moved in one direction only, slowly and without drama, and the people living inside it experienced it as normal, as the world continuing to change, as it had always changed, as their children inheriting a slightly harder version of what they had inherited from their own parents. The Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 before the Common Era, saw the near simultaneous disappearance of multiple civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean: the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the great civilization of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, others. Climate data recovered from cave stalagmites shows a severe, multi-decade drought striking the entire Eastern Mediterranean at precisely this period, disrupting the agricultural foundations that had sustained complex palace economies for centuries. Letters written on clay tablets, some of the last records from these civilizations, mention ships sent for emergency grain shipments that never arrived. Kings writing to other kings, describing the famine in their lands. Refugees moving in large numbers. And then the letters stop. The tablets stop. The palaces were burned or abandoned, and a dark age settled over the region that lasted several centuries, during which literacy itself largely disappeared in Greece. What ended was not humanity's capacity for complexity. What ended were the specific fragile arrangements that had carried that complexity to that point. And from those endings, slowly new things grew. New languages, new technologies, new arrangements better suited to changed conditions. The Little Ice Age, which settled over much of the Northern Hemisphere between roughly 1300 and 1850 of the Common Era, was not a dramatic glaciation. It was a series of cooler decades, interspersed with relatively warmer periods that nevertheless had profound effects on agricultural productivity across Europe and Asia. Harvests failed repeatedly. The grain that had supported growing medieval populations became uncertain. The Greenland Norse colonies, which had sustained themselves for several centuries by maintaining cattle and growing hay in marginal conditions, found those conditions tipping past the point of viability. By the 15th century, the Norse presence in Greenland was gone, not conquered, not destroyed, but made unsustainable by conditions that shifted just enough to close the narrow window in which their particular mode of life had been possible. These are the slow endings, the ones that accumulate below the threshold of dramatic notice, that feel to the people inside them like a series of bad years, each manageable, each recoverable from, until one day the cumulative weight is not recoverable from. the ones that historians can only see clearly in retrospect, looking back at the data and finding the pattern that no one individual living through it could have perceived. There is something clarifying in understanding civilizations this way, not as monuments to human achievement that were then betrayed by weakness or corruption or failure, but as living systems that existed in relationship with their environments that were always both shaped by and shaping the world around them, and that eventually encountered conditions that exceeded their capacity to adapt. Not failures, just systems meeting their limits. Now let us think about something stranger. Let us think about us. 10,000 years from now, if some form of the human story continues, if some future civilization exists in some form we cannot predict, what will they find of what we are building right now? Our buildings are, by geological standards, fragile. Reinforced concrete has a functional lifespan of perhaps 100 to 300 years without active maintenance. Most modern structures, left unattended for a few centuries, would be unrecognizable, overgrown, collapsed, their materials returned to more basic forms. Steel rusts, concrete fractures, vegetation finds every crack and works its patient way through, the same way it worked through the temples of Angkor. Our towers and bridges and stadiums will eventually do what all structures do: soften, settle, collapse, and be covered. The earth will file them away, layer by layer, into the sediment of centuries. Our roads may be more durable. Roman roads are still detectable in the European landscape 2,000 years later, not as usable surfaces, but as persistent linear features in the soil, visible from the air, readable in the chemistry of the ground. Our highway systems, buried under future soil, may remain detectable as geological formations for a very long time. Our plastics will persist in various forms for thousands of years in most environmental conditions. Future scientists may find layers of this material in the sediment record the way we find layers of iridium marking the moment an asteroid struck the Earth. The plastic age, the moment when one particular species began depositing a new kind of material into the geological record at a global scale, permanently, and in quantities that can be detected anywhere on the planet. Our digital archives have lifespans measured in decades. Without active maintenance, the formats change, the hardware becomes unreadable, the institutions that maintain the servers have their own lifespans. Even paper degrades across centuries in most conditions. The most durable recording technology human beings have ever used is stone inscription, and even stone is subject to erosion and deliberate destruction. The Garamantes Sahara tunnels, cut through solid rock, may outlast most of what we are building right now. A civilization 10,000 years from now, excavating the sites where our city stood, would find evidence of our presence. Extensive, globally distributed, chemically distinctive evidence. Layers of concrete and steel and plastic and glass. The traces of our agriculture in the isotopic signatures of the soil. The altered chemistry of the atmosphere, preserved in ice cores. They would know we were here, and they would know we were many, and they would know we changed the planet in ways that persisted long after we were gone. But they would not understand most of what they found. They would construct narratives about us, some closer to accurate than others, and they would probably call us, among themselves, a lost civilization. And in that designation, we would join the Garamantes and the builders of Pavlopetri, and the people who painted the walls of Çatalhöyük. We would join the company of everyone who ever built something and lived in it and believed it would stand longer than it did. This is not a frightening thought unless we choose to make it one. It is simply the shape of things. We are not the end of the story. We are a chapter, more elaborate in some ways than previous chapters, less so in others. And we will pass, as everything passes, into the long narrative that does not require any particular chapter to be permanent in order to continue. What lasts? If you could strip away everything that will eventually be reclaimed by the earth, the buildings and the roads and the archives and the languages in their current forms, what remains? What do all of these civilizations, from the Garamantes to Angkor to the builders of Stonehenge, have in common with each other and with us? They all looked at the sky and tried to make sense of what they saw there. Every culture we have visited tonight, from the desert engineers of Libya to the Maya astronomers of Central America, from the people who placed the blue stones of Stonehenge to the craftspeople of Pavlopetri imitating Minoan pottery styles, every one of them was engaging in the same fundamental human activity, trying to understand their position in the world, their relationship to time and space and the things that outlast individual human lives. They all cared for their dead. Every civilization we know of has found ways to honor the people who are gone, to mark the ending of a life as meaningful, to keep the connection between the living and the dead from dissolving entirely. The graves beneath the floors of Çatalhöyük, the pyramid tombs of the Garamantian kings, the stone-lined graves on the seafloor at Pavlopetri, still there after 5,000 years. Care for the dead may be the most durable human behavior, more durable than any language, any writing system, any form of government. They all built things that were meant to last, not because they expected those things to last forever. Nobody who has watched stone weather and wood rot could believe that, but because the act of building for permanence is a way of saying that what you are doing here matters, that the particular arrangements of your community, your understanding of the cosmos, your relationships with each other and with the world around you are worth the effort of making them physical, worth pressing into stone, worth cutting into mountains, worth carrying blue stones 250 kilometers across difficult terrain. And they all ended or transformed into something different enough that the original no longer exists in any recoverable sense. This, too, is part of what they share with each other and with us. The atoms that once made up a Garamantian engineer descending into her Sahara tunnel by lamplight are still somewhere in the world tonight. They have been part of many other things since then. Part of the Saharan soil, part of the desert air, part of living things across 20 centuries of continuous transformation. They are not gone. They are redistributed, still part of the story. And the atoms that make up you, right now, in whatever quiet place you are resting in tonight, they too have been many other things, and they will be many other things after you are done with them. You are a temporary arrangement of matter that has existed before in other forms and will exist again in other forms. The civilization you are part of is temporary in exactly the same sense, not diminished by that temporariness, but perhaps made more vivid by it, more worth inhabiting fully and honestly, with some humility about what we do not know and cannot control. Somewhere beneath the Libyan desert, the Fogaras still trace their ancient geometry in the dark. 750 kilometers of tunnels cut through stone and clay by hands that have been gone for 1,500 years, built at a calculated angle that would carry water by gravity alone, built for a resource that has since retreated below their reach. They are dry now and still, but they are there, holding the shape of an intention that sustained a great civilization for 1,000 years. In the Abukir Bay, 12 meters below the surface, the statues of Thonis Heracleon lie in the sediment. They have been there for more than 1,200 years. They are in no hurry to be found, and they do not need to be found to be there. The sea holds them with perfect patience. In Cambodia, the roots of the strangler figs at Ta Prohm continue their slow conversation with the stone. The morning light at Angkor Wat still falls the way it was designed to fall. The calculation that produces it is still correct. The stones of Stonehenge hold their alignment regardless of whether anyone is there to observe it or can remember why it was built. On the morning of every summer solstice, the light arrives exactly where it was intended to arrive 5,000 years ago by people who understood that some things should outlast their builders. And the streets of Pavlopetri lie on the seafloor in the clear Mediterranean water, visible to anyone who takes the time to descend. The outlines of the rooms are still the outlines of rooms. The graves are still where they were placed. Nothing has been erased. Everything has only been relocated, only been made quiet. These places are not gone. They are simply resting in a different relationship to the world above them. The sand rests over the walls. The water rests over the streets. The forest rests over the plazas. And in that resting, they are held more securely than they were when they were being used, in a way held by the earth itself, which is patient beyond any human measure of patience, and which keeps what it is, given with a care that has no urgency and no end. What does it feel like to be the last person who knows something? Not the last expert in a field, which still implies colleagues and libraries and the infrastructure of recorded knowledge, but the last person in the world who holds a particular understanding inside a living mind, who can hear the sound of a language when they read its marks, who knows the correct sequence of a ceremony no one else remembers, who understands what a particular arrangement of stones in a particular valley means in relation to the stars above it in a particular season. What does it feel like to be that person and to know it? We cannot answer that question from the outside. We can only approach it from the edges, by thinking about what knowledge actually is when it is living, when it is held in a mind and in a body and in the daily practice of a community, versus what it becomes when it is merely recorded. A recipe written on paper is information, but the knowledge of how to cook it, the feel of the dough in your hands, the smell that tells you it is ready, the adjustments made without thinking because the humidity is different today or the grain came from a different field this season, that knowledge lives in hands and noses and accumulated experience, not in marks on a surface. The paper can survive the cook, but the paper does not know how to cook. This is the distinction that matters when we think about what oral civilizations had that we sometimes fail to credit them with. Their knowledge was not merely memorized in the way we memorize facts for an examination. It was embodied. It was maintained through use, the way a path through a forest is maintained by the feet that walk it, and overgrown quickly by the vegetation that rushes to fill any space no longer kept open by use. The Polynesian navigators who crossed the vast open Pacific without instruments, who found the Hawaiian archipelago and Easter Island and New Zealand and dozens of other islands scattered across the largest ocean on Earth, did so using a body of knowledge so complex and so precise that modern navigation experts, attempting to understand it, have spent decades simply cataloging its components. They read the swells, not just their direction, which can be perceived by anyone, but their character, the subtle differences in the way swells from different directions and distances feel through the hull of a canoe, which a trained navigator could distinguish with her body while lying on the floor of the vessel in the dark. They read the stars, but also the stars' relationship to each other, the way certain stars rose and set in specific directions from specific locations, the corrections that needed to be made for different seasons, the way star knowledge and swell knowledge and wind knowledge and the behavior of birds and the color of water and the smell of land all combined into a continuous, integrated perception of position and direction across thousands of kilometers of open water. When this knowledge was threatened by colonization, by the disruption of traditional practices, by the deaths of the people who held the most complete versions of it, it nearly vanished. For a period in the 20th century, only a handful of individuals remained who could practice traditional Polynesian wayfinding at its full depth. The revival that has since occurred, led by those few remaining practitioners and the communities that gathered around them, is one of the most remarkable acts of knowledge rescue in modern human history. But the near miss is instructive. The knowledge did not disappear because it was written down incorrectly or because the books were burned. It was at risk of disappearing because the chain of human transmission, the unbroken line of teacher and student, of body learning from body, of practice maintaining practice, had nearly been severed. When a written civilization falls, it leaves its texts, and future scholars can eventually decipher them. When an oral civilization is disrupted, the texts do not exist. There is only the silence of a chain that was broken and the impossibility of reconstructing what lived in the minds that are gone. The ancestral Puebloan people who left the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde were, as we have noted, not destroyed. They moved. They became the ancestors of the contemporary Pueblo peoples, and they brought their knowledge with them. But consider for a moment what it means to carry knowledge on a migration. You carry the practical knowledge, the building techniques, the farming methods, the ceremonies that have sustained your community through cycles of plenty and scarcity. You carry the stories that give meaning to the knowledge. You carry the names of places, though those places are now behind you and getting further behind you with every day. And you carry the relationships, the web of obligation and affection and shared history that makes a community rather than just a group of people moving in the same direction. What you cannot always carry is the relationship between your knowledge and the specific landscape you developed it in. The ancestral Puebloans knew their canyons intimately, knew which rock formations provided shelter in which weather, which cliff faces collected morning warmth, which springs could be relied upon in drought years, which slopes faced in the right direction for corn to ripen. That knowledge was not abstract. It was tied to specific places that they were now leaving. In their new locations, along the Rio Grande, they would have to develop new versions of that knowledge from the beginning, through the patient accumulation of generations of experience in an unfamiliar landscape. This is one of the invisible costs of every migration, every displacement, every forced or chosen departure from a place that has been home for generations. The landscape-specific knowledge, the most practical and grounded and hard-won layer of understanding about how to live in a particular place, does not transfer. It has to be built again, from scratch, in the new place. This is why human communities tend to stay in places even when conditions deteriorate, because the cost of leaving is not just the physical cost of movement, it is the cost of losing knowledge that cannot be carried. Now, let us stay with the slow endings a little longer, because there is something almost restful in them when you stop resisting the pace at which they move and simply allow yourself to move at their pace. Think about the Roman Empire not in its dramatic final years, but in its long, middle decline, spanning centuries during which it continued to function, continued to build, continued to trade and administer and maintain its institutions, while also, year by year, becoming something slightly less than it had been. Cities that had held 100,000 people shrank to 10,000, and the shrinking happened so gradually that no individual generation experienced it as catastrophe. Buildings fell out of use and were gradually quarried for their stone, not because invaders were tearing them down, but because the community no longer needed buildings of that size, and the materials were useful for smaller construction. Aqueducts that had once supplied clean water to populations of hundreds of thousands began to fall into disrepair, not because anyone decided to abandon them, but because the skilled workers who maintained them were fewer, and the administrative systems that had coordinated their maintenance had simplified, and the population that had depended on them had declined. This process has a name in the scholarly literature: complexification and then simplification. Complex systems require enormous ongoing investment to maintain their complexity. The Roman road network, the Roman aqueducts, the Roman legal system, the Roman logistical infrastructure that could move troops and goods across an empire spanning 3 continents. Each of these required not just the original effort of construction, but continuous labor and coordination and administration to keep functioning. When the investment declined, the systems simplified. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, in the way that a garden simplifies when its gardener is too tired to weed it every day, gradually, over seasons, returning toward the wild state that preceded human effort. And this simplification is not always experienced as loss. Often, it is experienced as relief. The elaborate systems of a complex civilization are also elaborate systems of obligation and surveillance and taxation. When they simplify, there is often something that feels, to the people living through it, less like decline and more like release. The historian Brian Ward Perkins, writing about the end of Roman Britain, noted that the archaeological evidence shows a sharp and permanent drop in the quality of pottery after the Roman withdrawal. Pottery that had been wheel-thrown and kiln-fired was suddenly replaced by handmade, poorly fired ware. This is often cited as evidence of catastrophic decline. But Ward Perkins also notes that this simpler pottery was being made locally by people who no longer depended on a supply chain stretching to distant manufacturing centers, by communities who were, in some ways, more self-sufficient than they had been under the complex arrangements of imperial supply, which is better, which represents more of what we should call civilization, the wheel-thrown pottery that required a continent-spanning economic system to produce and distribute. Or the handmade pottery that could be produced by any community with clay and fire and a few experienced hands? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuinely difficulty one. And the difficulty is instructive. Complexity is not the same as well-being. The size of a civilization is not the same as its quality. And what looks from the outside, from the perspective of a later time like collapse and loss, may have been experienced from the inside by the people living through it as something more ambiguous, as both loss and freedom, both diminishment and relief. The Mayan cities that emptied during the Terminal Classic period were not the only cities the Maya had. The northern lowlands continued to flourish for centuries after the southern cities went quiet. The trading cities of the coast thrived. The populations that moved carried their knowledge and their traditions and their languages, and those things survived. What the jungle reclaimed was not the Maya people, but one particular expression of what the Maya people had chosen to build during one particular period. That expression was extraordinary. Its ending was real. But neither the expression nor the ending was the whole story. There is something important in this distinction. We have a tendency, when looking at the past, to take the most dramatic expressions of a civilization, the largest temples, the most ambitious engineering, the densest urban concentrations, and to treat those as the civilization itself, as if the meaning of what those people were doing lived in the stone and the scale and the ambition, rather than in the daily lives of ordinary people, farming and raising children and telling stories and negotiating the ordinary difficulties of living in community with other human beings. The great monuments are what survives. The ordinary life is mostly what is lost. And so, we unconsciously come to think of the monuments as the substance and the ordinary life as merely the background against which the monuments were made. But the monuments were made for the ordinary life. They were made by ordinary people, thousands of them, over generations, in service of values and meanings that those ordinary people held collectively. When the monuments are abandoned, the ordinary life does not necessarily end. It continues in simpler forms, in different places, under different arrangements, carrying forward whatever was most essential from what came before. The people who walked away from the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde took their knowledge of corn cultivation and their ceremonial traditions and their kinship structures and their accumulated understanding of how to live in the high desert. They did not take the buildings. The buildings were not the civilization. They were a record of the civilization pressed into stone by a community that is still present today. And now, very gently, toward the end of our journey tonight, the question of what lasts is not a question about physical materials. Stone lasts longer than wood. Metal lasts longer than cloth. But none of them last indefinitely. And in the time frames we have been moving through tonight, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, the difference in durability between stone and wood is merely a difference in the speed of the same process. Everything, given enough time, returns to simpler forms. What lasts in a different sense, what persists across civilizations, what travels from one arrangement of human living to the next, is harder to name precisely, but not impossible to gesture toward. It is the recognition that certain things matter. Not specific things. The specific things that mattered to the Garamantes are not the same things that matter to us. And what matters to us will not be the same as what matters to whoever comes after. But the category of mattering, the insistence that some things are worth effort, worth care, worth the construction of elaborate systems to protect and maintain, that insistence seems to survive every collapse, every migration, every dark age. It goes underground for a while. It simplifies. It loses its elaborate formal expression. And then it emerges again, in new forms, in new places, building new things that will also eventually end. It is the impulse to mark time. Every civilization we have visited tonight had ways of marking time, not just the practical measurement of seasons for agricultural purposes, but the more mysterious, more deeply human insistence on locating the present moment within a larger pattern. Stonehenge as an instrument for marking the turning of the year, the Maya calendar system that located any given day within interlocking cycles stretching back thousands of years and forward thousands more. The Roman system of consuls and emperors whose reigns provided the framework within which events were dated. Our own system of numbered years measured from an agreed historical point. The specific systems differ enormously. The impulse behind them, to know where we are in time, to locate ourselves within something larger than a single lifetime, is constant. It is the creation of beauty for its own sake. The painted walls of Çatalhöyük, 9,000 years old, covered with images of hunting scenes and geometric patterns and the shapes of animals that had meaning to the people who painted them. The carved stone faces on the temples of Angkor, worn now by centuries of rain and root, but still recognizably faces, still recognizably expressions of something a sculptor wanted to say about the divine. The pottery of Pavlopetri, its artisans carefully copying the fashionable styles of Minoan Crete, not because they needed to, but because beauty and sophistication and participation in the aesthetic currents of their world mattered to them. The elaborate geometry of the Sahara system, which was not merely functional engineering, but also, in its scale and its precision and its audacity, an expression of what the Garamantes people believed themselves capable of. Everywhere we look in the archaeological record, we find evidence of people making things more beautiful than they needed to be. Vessels that could have held water just as effectively if they had been undecorated, but which were decorated anyway, with care and skill. Buildings that could have kept people sheltered if they had been plain, but which were carved and painted and oriented toward the sky. Graves that could have kept the dead in the earth if they had been simple pits, but which were lined with stone and marked with care and supplied with objects that the living believed their dead would want or need in whatever came after. This impulse to make things more than merely functional, to press meaning and beauty into the materials of everyday life, does not seem to be a luxury that civilizations develop after they have solved their survival problems. It seems to be simultaneous with survival, as if the two things are not separate concerns, but aspects of a single thing. The Garamantes, whose survival depended entirely on the maintenance of their extraordinary irrigation system, also built pyramid tombs for their kings and inscribed their language into stone, and conducted elaborate trade networks that brought them luxury goods from the Mediterranean coast. The ancestral Puebloans, whose survival required careful management of scarce water and soil in a demanding environment, also painted their kiva walls with complex ritual imagery and made pottery of astonishing geometric delicacy. People do not become human first and then become interested in beauty. They are interested in beauty at the same time as they are interested in survival, because beauty is part of what makes survival feel worthwhile. And perhaps that is what persists, not the specific beautiful things. Those are claimed eventually by the sand and the water and the roots, but the insistence on making beautiful things, the refusal to accept that purely functional is good enough. The conviction held by every human community we know of that the world should be shaped by more than necessity. In the long, quiet dark of the deep hours of the night, when the ordinary world is at its most still, there is something almost palpable about the continuity of this. You are breathing the same air that was breathed by the people who built the Saharas and the people who walked the streets of Pavlopetri, and the people who oriented Stonehenge toward the solstice sun, not metaphorically, literally. The atoms of the air move through time in ways that do not respect the boundaries between civilizations or centuries. The carbon that was exhaled by a Garamantian farmer looking up at the Saharan stars 2,000 years ago is statistically likely to be somewhere in the air you are breathing right now. The boundaries between us and the past are much more permeable than they appear. And the questions that occupied all of those people, who were we? What were we doing here? What comes after? How do we make something worth making in the time we have? Are the same questions that are still being asked in different forms and different languages and different cultural frameworks by every human being alive right now, including you, even in the quiet of this particular night, even in the drowsiness that is beginning to soften the edges of your thoughts. You carry those questions. They are not urgent right now. They do not need to be answered tonight. They can rest the way the cities rest, the way the Saharas rest in the dark beneath the desert. Everything is resting under its stars. The sea is resting over its sunken streets. The forest is resting around its stone temples. The past is resting in the patient custody of the earth. and you are resting too, held by the same world that has held and released so many arrangements of human life, with the same patience, the same unhurriedness, the same complete absence of judgment about whether what it is holding is a great empire or a single sleeping person. The civilizations went. The earth remained. The sky remained, moving between its forms, evaporating from the sea, falling as rain into the Saharan aquifer, moving through the fog auras in the dark, returning to the sea again across centuries, carrying the memory of everything it has touched and telling it to nothing, holding it without language, without intention, without any need to be understood. The stars that the Maya tracked with such precision are the same stars above you tonight, moving in the same patterns, indifferent to the rise and fall of every civilization that has ever looked up at them. The sun that Stonehenge was oriented toward rises tomorrow exactly as it rose on the morning that the last stone was placed in position 5,000 years ago. Exactly as it will rise 10,000 years from now, when whatever comes after us is trying to make sense of what we left behind. You do not need to make sense of any of this tonight. You do not need to hold it all together into a coherent understanding. You can let it be simply what it is. The long story of people living and building and wondering and passing on, in an unbroken thread that stretches from the first human community that looked up at a dark sky and felt the need to say something about it, all the way through to here, to this room, to this breathing, to this moment that is already becoming memory as it passes. Let the weight of all of it settle. Let it press you gently into the surface beneath you, the way sediment settles slowly through still water, finding its level, coming to rest in the place it was always moving toward. The Garamantes built their tunnels in the dark and the heat, carrying the water of a greener world to their fields and their cities and their children. You do not need to carry anything right now. The tunnels are dry. The fields are sand. The children of those children have become the children of the world, scattered and transformed, and still here, still breathing, still asking the old questions in new forms. And the stone wall somewhere beneath the desert, in the dark, in the deep and patient keeping of the earth, is still there, still holding the shape of a room where someone once rested, as you are resting now, under the same sky, in the same world, belonging to the same long story. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a long journey into the past, a quality different from ordinary quiet. It is the silence of perspective, the silence of having stood even briefly and imaginatively in the company of people and places separated from you by vast distances of time, and having noticed that the distance is real but not absolute, that something crosses it, that you are not entirely separated from the builders of Stonehenge and the engineers of the Fagaras and the artisans of Pavlopetri by the millennia between you. You are connected to them by the very fact of being human, of living a life that has some of the same textures as theirs, regardless of how different the specific arrangements are. Consider what an ordinary day held in common for you and for a craftsperson in Mohenjo-Daro 4,000 years ago. You both woke up. You both were, for at least a moment, uncertain what the day held. You both were embedded in a web of relationships, with family, with neighbors, with the community whose expectations and judgments shaped your behavior, whether you were thinking about them or not. You both ate food that someone had grown or gathered or prepared. You both worked at something with your hands or your mind. You both, at some point in the day, noticed something beautiful, light falling at a particular angle, or a sound that stopped you for a moment, or the face of someone you cared about. And you both eventually came to the end of the day and found a place to rest. The specific content of these shared structures was entirely different. The food was different, the relationships were different, the work was different, the beauty you noticed was different. The fears and satisfactions and worries were different, but the structure was the same. Waking, working, noticing, resting. This is the template that every human life has been built on for as long as human beings have existed. And it is the template that connects you to every civilization we have visited tonight more surely than any monument or inscription or artifact. The civilization that produced the Phageras is gone, in the sense that no one today identifies as Garamantian, that the political and social arrangements those tunnels sustained no longer exist, that the specific agricultural system they made possible has been reclaimed by the desert. But the people who built those tunnels were people in exactly the same sense that you are a person. They had the same neurology, the same emotional range, the same fundamental needs and fears and hopes. They loved particular people and found others difficult. They had days when the work went well and days when it did not. They looked up at the same stars and felt the same particular feeling that the stars produce in human beings who look at them, that complicated mixture of smallness and wonder, and something that is almost, but not quite, comfort. When you look at the ruins of what they built, when you let the scale of their engineering settle into your understanding, the 750 kilometers of hand-cut tunnel in the dark beneath the Sahara, you are not looking at the past. You are looking at people, at what people do when they believe that what they are doing matters, at the evidence of care pressed permanently into stone, waiting for someone to recognize it for what it is. This is the true continuity. Not the continuity of monuments which end, not the continuity of languages which change beyond recognition, not the continuity of specific cultural practices which evolve and sometimes vanish, but the continuity of the impulse behind all of those things, the impulse to make something, to maintain something, to leave a mark that says we were here and we cared about what we were doing. That impulse is in you right now, even in rest, even in the state approaching sleep, where the conscious mind is releasing its grip on the day and the deeper mind is preparing to do its own slow and necessary work. The impulse does not sleep. It is part of what you are, inherited across an unbroken chain from the first human being who looked at a stone and imagined what it could become. And in the morning, when you wake, you will carry it forward again, in whatever particular form your life takes, in whatever specific arrangements of work and relationship and attention that constitute your day. You will be doing what every person in every civilization we have visited tonight was doing. You will be trying to make something worth making, in the time and with the materials available to you. You will be part of the story. Tonight, though, the story rests. The great hydraulic city of Angkor is quiet under its canopy, the roots of the trees moving in their millimetric way through the cracks in the sandstone, carrying the slow work of centuries forward into the dark. The streets of Pavlopetri are quiet under the Mediterranean, the water moving in its gentle, shallow currents over the 5,000-year-old stones. The Phageras are dry and still in the deep dark beneath the Fazan. The solstice light will come again to Stonehenge when morning comes, and it will find the stones exactly where they have always been, patient as only stones can be patient. And you are exactly where you should be, warm, still, supported, part of the same long story as all of these places and all of these people, held by the same world that held them, breathing the same air, under the same stars. Let everything else go. The day that is past, The day that is coming will arrive at its own time without your help. As days always do, tonight you belong to the long silence between civilizations, the restful dark where everything that was and everything that will be can simply be, without demand or urgency, without explanation or justification. Simply resting, simply here, simply held. Think for a moment about what the desert remembers. The Sahara, in its current form, is roughly 5,000 years old, which sounds ancient but is, in geological terms, a very recent condition. Before that, it was green. Lakes reflected the sky, where now there is only sand. Hippopotamuses moved through rivers that have been dry for millennia. The people who eventually became the Garamantes were, in some sense, the inheritors of a landscape memory. The memory of water that had once been there, stored now not in the surface but in the deep rock, available to those who knew enough to ask for it in the right way. This is an extraordinary idea when you sit with it. A civilization built on the memory of rain that fell thousands of years before that civilization existed. The water the Garamantes drank and grew their crops with was ancient rain. Rain from a world that had passed before their great-great-grandparents were born, held in the rock like a letter waiting to be opened. And they opened it, and they built a world around what was inside. What does it mean to build a civilization on the memory of something that is no longer present? The Green Sahara was not a myth to the Garamantes. They would not have known its name or its extent or its precise history, but its legacy was real. The water that made their civilization possible. In a sense, every civilization is built on memories like this, on inheritances that predate the civilization itself by generations or centuries or millennia, on the accumulated gifts of what came before. The topsoil built by forests that were cleared, the aquifers charged by ancient rains, the seeds developed by generations of farmers who are now forgotten, the knowledge accumulated by minds that are now dust. We are always living partly on the savings of the past, the resources we draw on, physical, intellectual, cultural, were accumulated over time frames that dwarf the span of any individual civilization. And when we draw on them faster than they can be replenished, we eventually reach the same conclusion the Garamantes reached. The water table drops below the level of the tunnels, and the cities that depended on it must change or move or end. This is not a parable about our current moment, though the resonance is clear enough to be felt without stating. It is simply a pattern that recurs in the record of human civilizations, visible across many cultures and many centuries. The difficulty of maintaining a sustainable relationship with the resources that sustain you, the tendency of success to generate demands that eventually outpace supply, the moment when the arithmetic tips from accumulation to depletion, and the civilization begins the long work of adapting to a new reality. The Garamantes adapted for centuries by deepening their tunnels, by reaching further down, by finding ways to extend the reach of their technology to follow the declining water table. And this worked for a while. It is a deeply human response to a constraint. Push harder, reach further, extend the system that has worked so far. The point at which it stopped working was not a failure of will or intelligence. It was simply the physical limit of what the technology could reach, imposed by an aquifer that was finite. There is a kind of dignity in this. They used what they had as well as they could for as long as it lasted. They built something extraordinary in the time they had. And when the conditions that had made it possible changed beyond the reach of their adaptation, they became something smaller, something more modest, something sustainable in the reduced conditions that remained. Not a collapse into nothing, a contraction into something more closely matched to what the environment could still support. Every ending is also a beginning of something smaller and more appropriate. The forest that reclaims a city is not the end of the forest. It was there before the city, and it will be there long after the last stone has softened into soil. The sea that covers a coastal settlement is not indifferent to what it covers. It preserves it in the cold dark, in a stillness that the surface world never offers. The desert that buries a civilization does not erase it. It keeps it in the dry dark, where the absence of moisture holds things in place across centuries. The earth is not indifferent. It keeps. It holds. It returns things changed and transformed, but fundamentally present, to the surface of awareness when the conditions are right, when a satellite passes overhead at the right angle, when a diver descends into the right bay, when an archaeologist presses a core into the right square meter of sediment and finds, in its layers, the record of everything that happened there. Nothing is truly lost. Everything is held. The question is only how long the holding lasts and what form the thing takes when it is finally returned. Sometimes it comes back as ruins, sometimes as stories, sometimes as the chemistry of soil that still remembers what grew in it 1,000 years ago, sometimes as the silence of a canyon where the walls still hold the outlines of rooms, waiting with the patience of stone. Your own memory works something like this. The things you have forgotten are not gone. They are held in forms you cannot consciously access, in the sediment layers of your experience, in the chemistry of neurons that were shaped by things you no longer consciously remember. The dream that feels meaningless in its detail but leaves a residue of feeling. The face you cannot quite place but recognize. The knowledge that lives in your hands when you perform a task you have not consciously thought about in years. The deep material of your experience, accumulated and held in forms that are not directly available to conscious memory, shaping what you are and how you move through the world without requiring you to think about it. You are, in this sense, your own civilization. You have your own accumulated past, your own layers of experience laid down year by year, your own sunken streets and buried walls and dry tunnels. And just as the civilizations we have visited tonight did not disappear, but only changed their relationship to the surface, your past does not disappear, but only changes its relationship to your awareness. It is held. It is there. And occasionally, in dreams, or in the half-waking state that borders sleep, it surfaces, transformed, rearranged, speaking in symbols rather than words, but real. Still real? Let it be real tonight. Let the layers of your own experience rest in their keeping, as the layers of the civilizations rest in theirs. Let the water table be where it is. Let the fog settle over the canyon. Let the fish move through the doorways. You do not need to excavate anything tonight. You do not need to rest, as everything rests, in the patient keeping of whatever holds you. Rest now. The story continues without your help, the way it always has, the way it always will. If you happen to still be awake, you can go ahead and watch the next chapter now. And if these slow journeys into the world's oldest places help you find rest at the end of the day, it would mean a great deal if you left a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps others who need this find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. I hope you sleep well and dream softly. Good night.